Hi, everybody. I'm Fernando Huesca from BOAP University in Puebla, Mexico. First, I want to thank Peter and Christine for the invitation to this conference. I'm going to talk about Karl Marx, materialism, dialectics, epistemology, and psychedelics. Some conceptual framework to begin with. Materialism. In Marx, this implies being comes before consciousness, matter comes before mind. Flesh and bones come before mental states. With Marx, we're going to talk about ideas, mental states, right? But we're going to talk at the same time about flesh, bones, material object things in a very simple way. Now, concerning dialectics, a couple of ideas. Everything is contradictory. What is living carries intrinsic contradictions. Every material or mental reality is a constant process. This comes from Hegel. We're going to talk about Hegel afterwards. Another idea. There are pleasant substances and use of pleasant substances which are harmful to the human body. The working classes suffer especially the destructive effects of those substances. Marx talks in the sources specifically about alcohol and opium. We're going to see that also afterwards. Now, another idea. Prostitution, drug addiction, and indebtedness are not moral, but economic structural problems. This has to do with Marx's materialist ontology. Now, concerning health and also mental health, Marx's idea is that it is a public, not a private issue. This has to do also with intrinsic problems with capitalist markets. Now, some notes on Marx. It is an author which is very difficult to read in translations and in the German original. It is also very difficult to translate. I even dare to say in a very vulgar way that it is a pain in the ass to translate Marx, but I guess there is some accord on this matter. Marx's style is very ironic, satirical, and we would say in a contemporary way, quite acid. There will be some examples of this afterwards. Now, volume 2 and 3 of Capital were never written by Marx himself, neither the definitive form of the scientific history of political economy, which Marx considered as a project of appendix to his Capital. All these materials, volume 2 and 3 of Capital, were written by Engels. And another note, Marx has been used productively in critical theories and practices. Now, concerning Marx and philosophy, I'm going to need to check something on the slide because it's covered by the camera here. So it's going to be like a little pause. I'm going to read in another screen. So just a second. All right, yeah. Concerning Marx and philosophy, a quote from Spanish-Mexican philosopher Adolfo Sánchez Vázquez in his text Philosophy of Praxis. He says, Marxism is above all, we still defend this, a philosophy of praxis, and not a new praxis in philosophy. The constitution of Marxism as science against ideology or utopia is certainly primordial, but it is only explained by its practical character, that is only from, in, and for praxis. End of quote. This has to do with this very famous thesis on Feuerbach from Marx, which says, I quote, philosophers have done nothing else than interpreting the world in different ways. The point, however, is to change it. What does this mean in a very simple way? A turn from idealism to materialism. That means also in a very simple way, talking about products of the hand in terms of products of the head. Like this example, talking about rice, bread, tortilla, something you eat in order to ease hunger and stuff. Instead of absolute idea, monad, entelechy, which you cannot eat. So that's the point. Now, concerning contributions to science in general, I would say it's also important to note on Marx's concept of Wissenschaft, which is a German concept. I'm going to read it here. It says, the materialist conception of history is to be taken as something different from bourgeois ideology or idealist teleology of history. This could imply mystification and therefore fetishization. So I would say that's Wissenschaft science for Marx. Now, concerning contributions to economics, in specific concerning theory of value, quote from Capital from Marx. It says, the commodity is above all an exterior object, a thing which through its properties satisfies human needs of some sort. The nature of these needs, for example, if they originate in the stomach or in fantasy, changes nothing in the thing. Here is also not about how the thing satisfies this human need, whether in an immediate way as the products, that is, as an object of enjoyment, or in a detour, like means of production. Each useful thing like iron, paper, etc., must be considered on a double point of view, namely quality and quantity. Each such thing is a whole of many properties, and therefore can be useful from many sides. To discover these different sides, and therefore the many ways of use of things, is a historical act, end of quote. Now, concerning this, a couple of comments. Smith said, Ricardo, the whole classical school of political economy, then marginalism and mainstream economics. They all reduce use value and economic valuations to capitalist use of things. That is, use value in uncritical, unscientific for Marx economic discourse is always exchange value. Therefore, the human body and nature would tend to be reduced to commodities or automatizable things in uncritical economic discourse and capitalist markets. Production, in a capitalist sense, therefore, is production of exchange value or commodity value. That means reification of human beings and nature. So, Marxists like Lukács, Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, Marcuse, Sanchez Vasquez himself, Marxism as a tradition, you could say, is in great accord with this thesis. A great problem of capitalist markets is the commodity form. Now, concerning theory of capital, Edwin Cannon differentiates between pseudo-distribution, that is a theory of individual incomes in singular capitalist production units, and distribution, that is a theory of apportionment of global produce among different social classes. Capitalist distribution is inherently problematic because of the unproportionate growth of the units of production of means of production in proportion to the growth of the units of production of means of subsistence. Too many tons of iron, while there are numerous sectors of capitalist society with undercoverage of nutrition, health, housing, and clothing needs. This is the scheme of reproduction. You could say volume 2 and 3 of Capital have to do with a continuation of physiocracy and Ricardian economic models. And the thing is to relate the incomes and outflows of different classes of society. So these schemes of reproduction have to do, in a word, with macroeconomics. That's distribution for Cannon. Now, a big quote from volume 2 of Capital, which is Engels writing more than Marx writing himself. So it says, I would say it's very difficult and then to translate and even to read, but here it goes. It says, it has been seen before what with the development of productivity of labor, therefore also with the development of the capitalist mode of production, which develops the social productive force of labor much more than all other previous modes of production, the material mass which is incorporated into the process of production in the form of means of labor in a definitive way, and in a way which always returns, and in the way of means of production, buildings, machinery, etc. which during periods of time, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, they play a role in this process, grows constantly, and that the growth in this mass is as condition, as effect of the development of the social productive force of labor, that not only absolute growth, but also relative growth of wealth in this form characterizes above all the capitalist mode of production, the forms of material existence of constant capital, the means of production, not only consist in means of labor of this or that type, but also in the materials for labor, for the distinct steps of production and also auxiliary stuff, with the hierarchical scale of production and the growth of the productive force of labor by means of cooperation, division, machinery, etc., the mass of raw materials, of auxiliary stuff, etc., which go into the direct reproduction process grows. End of quote. Now, concerning contributions to history or historical science, quote from Marx, The German Ideology. It says, this conception of history consists then in exposing the real process of production, setting off from the material production of immediate life, and in conceiving the exchange form corresponding to this mode of production, and the form which is engendered by it, that is, civil society in its diverse phases as the foundation of all history, presenting it in its action as a state, and explaining from the basis of the state all the diverse theoretical products and forms of consciousness, religion, philosophy, morality, etc. End of quote. So this has to do with Marx's materialist ontology, which has to do with a material basis or economic basis, those be Marx's terms, and an ideological, cultural, and symbolical dimensions. Then again, on the one side, machinery, and on the other side, ideas and mental states. Now, concerning dialectics and dialectical concepts, first a quote from Hegel. It says, contradiction is the rule of what is true. Non-contradiction, the rule of that which is false. This is in a text which is called On the Orbits of the Planets. It's an habilitation thesis. It's sure that Marx didn't read this text, but it is important in Hegelian studies because it's sort of a very condensed way to explain what dialectics is for Hegel or what Hegel thinks about contradiction. Now, another quote from Hegel, this is in the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences. This is a text which surely Marx read and knew. So this is a known published Hegelian source. It says here, Hegel, the pure being is then the pure abstraction, and therefore the absolute negative, which equally, if taken immediately, is the nothing. End of quote. This is also, I could comment, difficult to translate, but not as difficult to translate as Marx. So what's the problem with these sort of propositions from Hegel? So for Marx, it's okay. Marx even uses in Capital or in his text these Hegelian German formulas, an und für sich, it is translated generally as in and of itself. So those are Hegel terms which Marx uses in a very self-conscious way. But for Marx, it may be too much mystification of the concept or the idea. No, you don't eat ideas, you eat bread and butter, and you may add, you drink beer and wine. So another quote from Hegel, you could say that this is a quote which Marx would see as a good instance of social theory because it has a critical point of view towards capitalism or capitalist Marxist. Hegel says in his philosophy of right, another published text which Marx actually commented, and there is a published text concerning Marx's reading of Hegel's philosophy of right. Hegel says, here it is manifest that in the excess of wealth, civil society is not rich enough. That is, that it does not possess enough patrimony to direct the excess of poverty and the production of the populace. end of quote. So this is the dialectic of civil society. Those are Marx and Hegel terms. So I think they work together in understanding dialectic of civil society in this way. So in a simple proposition, we are richer and richer in capitalist societies, but also poorer and poorer. Now, concerning all this, Hegel he considers a valid social theory and practical category, the state. We can say it is, in Hegel, a welfare state. It is a constitutional state. We could add, in very contemporary terms, a multicultural state. But as it is a state, it has private markets inside. In Hegel, these private markets, these capitalist markets, they are a fact. It is not for anyone to decide on that. His theoretical and practical proposals concerning the problems of capitalist markets are to regulate them with institutions in order to avoid undesired externalities, as economic discourse now says. So an undesired externality is, for instance, fake red. It is a real problem which Marx tackles in Capital. It is also a real problem for Hegel. But of Hegel, this problem is tackled with institutions within a state in these terms. Now, for Marx, the state is a big, big problem. A quote from the Communist Manifesto. The government of the state is no more than a committee which administers the businesses common to the bourgeois class. So Marx is no theoretician which is in good terms with the state, even if it is a welfare state, I'm afraid. So now, what is communism? You could say historical communism for Marx. A quote from Marx, The Civil War in France. It says, the Commune, it means the Paris Commune, was constituted from the citizens' councils chosen in the distinct districts of Paris, from a universal right to vote, including women. At all times, they were subject to responsibility, and at all times, they were replaceable. Of course, the majority was composed of workers, of recognized representatives of the working class. The Commune had to be not a parliamentary body, but a working body, executive and legislative at the same time. The police and state bureaucracy, until then the tool of the state government, was stripped of all its political properties and turned into a tool with duties towards the Commune, and at all times replaceable. The same with the civil servants and all other branches of administration. The privileges and incomes acquired by the state officials disappear with these state offices themselves. The public offices is to be the private property of the cronies of the central government, not only urban administration, but the whole enterprise, until now ruled by the state, was placed in the hands of the Commune. End of quote. So you could say this is communism for Marx. The terms in German are kommunal Verfassung, that would be sort of communal constitution. So you could say this also implies scientifically. A particular society or a particular living organism is an ongoing process, even like this Paris Commune. There are transitions from one state to the other in natural and cultural realities. You could also say this is the dialectics of society for Marx and also for Hegel. A little comment on philosophy of mind. Concerning consciousness and action, it's important to think in collective terms for Marx. You could say a concept of social cognition would be important in a Marxist or materialist dialectic conception of the mind. But maybe more than philosophy of mind or Marxist philosophy of mind, you could talk of a critique of philosophy of mind. I think that's what Marx did with scientific discourse of its time, critique of political economy, critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, critique of everything. That's Marx. Now, a comment on materialist anthropology. This is a quote from Karl Marx, Kowalewski's notes. Here it says, "The arbitrary amputation of communal property from the silly British had destructive consequences. The division of common lands into districts weakened the principle of mutual aid and assistance. That is the vital principle of the community of kinship associations. The populated communities with great extensions of land are especially adapted according to the expressions of the silly ones themselves, in order to ameliorate and frequently to prevent completely the consequences of droughts, epidemics, and other catastrophes, which occasionally fall upon earth. United by bonds of law, close contact, and the community of interests produced only through these mechanisms, they are capable of resisting all possible accidents, giving up on them only for brief periods of time. And when the danger has passed, they dedicate themselves with known energy to carry on with labor. In case of fatality, each one can count with the rest." End of quote. Now, concerning colonial theory, you could also say a history from the perspective of the defeated. These are Miguel León de Portillas, a Mexican historian, words. Concerning the colonial thought, you could say, following Marx, barbarism is not inferior to civilization. This is a thesis which is also shared by Biko and Morgan. You could say Biko, Morgan, and also Marx and Engels considered the division of history in these terms: savagery, barbarism, and civilization. But there are not moral, but structural differences in these stages of history, in this conception. Interestingly, this implies an open epistemology. Marx makes these sort of questions. What names does this or that particular society uses? How do they name their political offices, their gods, etc.? Now, concerning heterosexual monogamy and patriarchal structuration as social archetype, a quote from Marx, excerpts from John Lubbock, The Origin of Civilization. It is a very difficult source to work with. Here, what I have done is to highlight in red what Marx adds to a quote which in itself comes from Lubbock. So this is a Lubbock quote, and there are some Marx additions on it. So Lubbock says, "Among many of the lower races, relationship through females is the prevalent custom. Therefore," all right, that would be Marx. "The curious," there goes a question, this sign added by Marx. "This curious practice and a man's hairs are not his own, but his sister's children." Marx adds then in a very ironical way. "But they are indeed not the man's hairs. These civilized donkeys, in German, civilisierte Esel, cannot get rid of their own conventionalities." So that's, again, Marx's ironic style. Now, concerning psychoactive substances, a quote from Enzo Traverso's Bohemia, Exile and Revolution, notes on Marx, Benjamin, and Trotsky. It says, "Briefly, Marx lived his life dedicated for a great part to the study of capitalist economy, as a permanent war against the restrictions of a relentlessly hostile monetary economy. Given his position as a foreigner and a Jew, his poverty, his intellectual anti-conformism, and his political engagement, he was always an outsider. His biography is inserted in a sociocultural context marked by the amazing characteristics of his precarious social exile, his cosmopolitanism, and revolutionary engagement, all this sharing a typical Bohemian style." A couple of images I found randomly in the internet, so how people are portrayed Marx office, his way of dealing with worker committees and stuff. there is bohemia around. That also is reflected actually in a Prussian report. I found this as a meme in the internet. I'm not going to read it, but it's quite funny. You take a look on it. So that is the Prussian state commenting on Marx's daily life. Now, concerning Marx and opium, and then Mexican pulque. First, a quote from Marx's text, Introduction to a Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. Here, Marx says, religion suffering is at the same time the expression of a real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. End of quote. It's a very known quote. It is clear that for Marx, religion and opium function as some sort of narcotic for individual and societies. I could comment on this, that this has been a very unfortunate or at least problematic fragment for Marxist tradition and practices. Now, concerning Marx's actual concern with opium, a quote from Capital. It is a really documented concern on dangerous practices, in this case, in working classes concerning opiates. Marx says, Dr. Edward Smith, during the cotton crisis caused by the American Civil War, was sent by the English government to Lancashire, Cheshire, and other places to report on the sanitary condition of the cotton operatives. He reported that from a hygienic point of view, and apart from the banishment of the operatives from the factory atmosphere, the crisis had several advantages. The women now had sufficient leisure to give their infants the breast, instead of poisoning them with Godfrey's cordial, an opiate. They had time to learn to cook. Unfortunately, the acquisition of this art occurred at a time when they had nothing to cook. End of quote. And then again, Marx's ironic style. Now, concerning opium in the ethnological notes. This is an excerpt from Marx's notes on Lubbock. Here says Marx. Right, and here it is. At 3 hours in the morning, the victim receives some milk to drink. When the preceding priest implores the goddess to shower her blessings on the people, etc., etc. The priest recounts the origin and advantage of the rite and concludes by stating that the goddess has been obeyed and the people assembled, etc. After the mock ceremony, nevertheless, the victim is taken to the group, where the sacrifice is to be carried out, and to prevent resistance, the bones of the arms and legs are broken, or the victim drugged with opium or datura, when the Jani wounds his victim with his axe. The crowd now press forward to obtain a place of his flesh, and in a moment he is stripped to the bones. End of quote. Now, concerning pulque, which is a Mexican alcoholic drink, the Aztecs had it. Interestingly, the Aztecs were a very festive society. You could say they really liked parties or religious festivals. You could also say that there is a continuity with this tradition in Mexico in some way. Now, Marx says, to maize, beans, squashes, and tobacco, now it was added cotton, pepper, tomato, cacao, and the care of certain fruits. A beer was made by fermenting the juice of the maguey, Mexican agave. The Iroquois had thought a similar drink, produced by fermenting maple sap, ahonard. End of quote. Now, concerning psychedelics in a real technical sense, this implies LSD, psilocybin, mescalin, and DMT, for instance. I could say Hegel's comments on witches and Van Helmont are more productive. You cannot find, you could say, a lot of materials in the sources on Marx concerning these actual psychedelics. But Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of subjective spirit do have trip reports or scientific reflections concerning psychedelics. Now, I think it could be interesting to hear Walter Benjamin's Mescalin assisted trip report, all right, on Mescalin. Benjamin says, the real signification of catatonia is the following. The subject of experimentation compares the fixed position of his hand with the outline of a drawing, which a draftman has fixed forever, such as if is possible for this draftman, through countless variations in the drawing, to always alter his image anew, or shade it anew. So it could also be that for a catatonic, through minuscule changes in the innervation, to change the circle of representations with which the catatonic position is united. The economic saving of this procedure represents a libidinal profit. With the catatonic, it is about this libidinal profit. End of quote. So that would be all. I would like to thank you for your attention